Today we begin to head towards Christmas with Matthew, also at times with a little bit of help from Mark and Luke, but primarily so that we can understand what Matthew is doing as he's telling the story. However, today we don't begin with the Christmas story. We begin where the lectionary starts us, with the apocalyptic speech of Jesus that comes towards the end of Matthew's gospel, and we're going to be considering the apocalyptic nature of Matthew's gospel. The Gospel of Matthew, a brief introduction, is the first book that we have in the order that we have them in the New Testament, so the first of the four Gospels, although it's widely believed with all sorts of good reasons that it was not the first Gospel written, that belongs to Mark. The tradition attributes the authorship of this gospel to the tax collector whom Jesus called, and in chapter 9, he is named as Matthew, even though in the same story in Mark and Luke, he is named as Levi. Nevertheless, what is happening in this gospel, as we shall see today, and as we will undoubtedly see again and again throughout these 4 weeks and through into next year, is that the Jewishness of Jesus, which is clearly there in Mark's gospel, is intensified in Matthew's account. This is the only gospel where Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. This is the only gospel where he says, quite strikingly, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he commands his disciples not to go amongst the Gentiles or the Samaritans. And this is the gospel, the only gospel in which Jesus says you have one teacher, one instructor, the Messiah, in contrast to the many teachers and instructors that were around in the scribes and the Pharisees. The apocalyptic nature of Matthew's gospel is sounded at the beginning with Jesus picking up John's call to repentance, but it's emphasized at various places. In chapter 13, a series of parables telling about how the kingdom of heaven will be established at the end of the age, when the righteous and the unrighteous will be judged. Good sheep separated from bad sheep. God will come in righteousness to execute judgment on the earth, a refrain through those chapters that are noted there. People are divided into evil and good, good seed and weeds, good fish and bad fish, sheep and goats. You can see how the duality is working right throughout the gospel. Jesus frequently promises or threatens, depending on your point of view, judgment. And there's just that string of references there, and a lot of them are in the notes that you have. The kingdom of heaven is to be established at the end of the age. And so what Jesus demands of his followers is tzedakah in Hebrew, dikaiosune in Greek, and Elizabeth and I like to translate this as righteous justice. So it's righteousness, it's justice, but it's both of those qualities in English carried by this word. And that's announced early on, is explained by Jesus through his parables, and especially in the climactic final parable of the sheep and the goats. So that's a summary of the apocalyptic nature of Matthew's gospel. In your notes, there's a distinction made between apocalyptic and eschatology, where eschatology is looking to what will happen at the end of time, but apocalyptic is saying that there will be a heavenly being bringing a message from God, intervening in the world to bring justice. So it's a much sharper and more full-on sense of looking at the end of time. And that's the character of Jesus in all three synoptic gospels, but it's backpedaled by Luke, it's put to the fore and intensified by Matthew. So here's our opening question to get your brains whirring and your tongues wagging. Why do you think that the lectionary begins the new church year with part of Jesus' apocalyptic speech, which comes from the very end of his ministry?
How did you go in your groups? Why do we have the apocalypse at the beginning of Advent when we're expecting a small baby in peaceful circumstances?
But were they expecting a small baby?
Not at the apocalypse, no.
No.
I meant at Christmas we're expecting a small baby,
Right.
but no.
Not in Matthew's gospel either, really. It just says, what does he say? She bore a son and gave him a name, and that's about it.
That's right. The name is what's important, of course, in Matthew's gospel, being Emmanuel, God is with us, and Jesus saves us, which is from Joshua or Yehoshua, which means to save. So the word Hosanna is also derived from that. So Jesus' name literally means save. And Emmanuel, of course, means God is with us. So that's important in Matthew's gospel.
Elizabeth, may I ask a question at this point?
Yes.
The very first chapter of Matthew sets out this genealogy.
Yes.
And then midway through, it gives us this nice symmetrical 14-point geometry. All the generations from Abraham to David are 14. And then from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. What's the significance of these three blocks of 14?
That's next week's study, Ian.
I can answer it briefly. Matthew likes numbers. Matthew likes magical biblical numbers. What does 14 divide into, good people?
7.
2 7.
It's 2 sevens. 7 is the magical number, not 14. But I know they're in blocks of 14, but it's 2 blocks of 7. Is that the right genealogy? Who knows? Matthew probably doctors it to make sure he's got his exact 77777. Because when we look at it next week compared with Luke, you'll find Luke's looks quite different.
Right.
Matthew has dropped out a whole lot of kings who are part of that genealogy anyway.
Well, they'll ruin his schema.
Can I go back to the, sorry.
Let's go back to the question. Yes, that's a good idea. We'll deal with the genealogy next week. So, apocalyptic. Why are we starting Advent with it?
Well, I thought that it was a way in which those who construct the lectionary get us to focus on, if you like, it's almost like a context, because what we face today, we've got the stories of Jesus, and sometimes it's Jesus meek and mild, and sometimes it's angry and whatever. But here, this is the purpose of, if you like, salvation and redemption, to be so that, well, not so that, but for your own salvation, so that you pass the test, if you like, the judgment. You go up, not go down. And I was thinking that it's really, so this is why Jesus came. This is the whole, and how it now applies to us, as opposed to his life story. It's about the application of the gospel to us. And I was saying in our group that when you go into a lot of Romanesque churches in Italy, some of them still have on the contrafacade, so that's the internal back wall as you walk out, the last thing you see as you left the mass was the last judgment, to remind. And I suppose I was thinking here, this is to remind us of the purpose of the coming of Christ.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer, Elizabeth. Does anyone want to comment on that or add something to that? That's probably exactly why it's sitting there.
Yeah, I think it's similar because, and then it's like the lectionary has been written since Matthew was written, a long while afterwards. And when you think of the way the Christmas story is presented as this very soft and gentle and darty with lots of tinsel and stuff, it's to ground us before we get into the tinsel and pretty stuff.
Mm.
Yeah. Yes, it's certainly, there's no tinsel or pretty stuff in the apocalyptic literature.
No, and really the Christmas story in its reality isn't tinsel either.
No, it isn't. No, it's not earthquakes and the earth sort of blowing apart either. So
no, but it's to ground us before we start looking at all that Christmas card stuff.
Okay, thanks, Enid. Anyone else got any comments they want to make on this?
When
Um,
was the lectionary written, constructed? Does anybody, John?
Oh, John can probably answer that.
Yeah, so the Revised Common Lectionary is a product of the 1970s and 80s, and it's an ecumenical enterprise.
Yep.
And it's based on the readings that were set for the Roman Catholic Mass. Now, they were revised in the 60s as part of, I think, as part of Vatican II. But so there's been in the Catholic Church for centuries, I don't know how far back, there's been set readings, lections. Lection means reading. So they had a daily lectionary and they had a Sunday lectionary. So there was a revision in the 60s. It became an ecumenical enterprise in the 70s and 80s, and I think it was revised in the 90s. Interestingly, I've discovered in the making of it, there was only one Roman Catholic on that ecumenical committee, and there was only one female
Of course.
on that committee in those days.
Yes.
How big was the committee, John?
20 or so. So, you know, by the time you got all the important men on, all the important Protestant men on, you know, no room at the inn, no room in the lectionary.
No room for anyone else.
Which denominations were represented? Were the Orthodox there?
No.
They have their own calendar.
Yes,
Ian?
It's all a bit biased, isn't it?
Well, it
Well,
is, because you've got Eastern Christianity, Western Christianity, and sort of Roman Catholic Christianity, which is kind of Western, but does deviate from
Yes.
Protestantism, or Protestantism deviates from it in certain parts. But the Orthodox follow a different season. Like their Easter's not the same, and their Epiphany and Christmas can move around in different places. Because Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity parted ways many centuries ago.
10 millennia ago. Yeah.
Yes. So they do deviate from each other quite significantly at certain parts of the lectionary and the Christian calendar.
Okay. I'm going to suggest we move on.
Yep.
We've got material on page 3 that puts Matthew alongside of Mark.
Yeah, you can have a look at it there. This is Matthew's chapter 24 in Matthew is pretty much all apocalyptic stuff. And he draws heavily, if you've been paying attention during the prophets, you'll recognise a lot of Matthew is drawn very heavily from the prophets and how the prophets describe the day of the Lord or the judgment. And that is the same for Mark and Luke as well. So this week's lectionary reading with Matthew is drawn from this, but Matthew has lots of extra material where he continues into chapter 25, explaining to you exactly what he means by some of this stuff in case you've missed the point. So looking at this one here, there's some interesting things in Matthew 24, as well as standard things. We have the things like you'll be handed over, tortured, and you'll be put to death. So that does indicate to us that there are some sort of Christian persecutions going on in the time of Matthew's writing. Hated by all nations, which may well just be code for hated by the Romans and the empire, for those who are Christians, and there will be betrayals and there will be nasty things happening and false prophets arising and leading many astray. And we know that this was a common accusation in the New Testament, and the various New Testament writers accuse other New Testament communities of not having the truth, and they've got the truth. So it wasn't a golden age of the church, as you might have been taught at all. There was a lot of argumentation in the first century about what was orthodox and what was correct and not correct. And Matthew, with his peculiar emphasis on the law, which is quite unique to him, really. The word that's used there is anomia, which is a is like un in English. You put it in front of a noun to make it the opposite. So you have law, and if you put an a in front of it, it becomes lawless. So Matthew talks about lawlessness. Now, it's often translated as wickedness or evil or other nouns like that in your New Testament. But it actually does mean to be without law. So there's the increase of those who are not following law, that is God's law, and love going cold. But if you endure to the end, you will be saved. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be saved in your flesh. It means you're going to be saved for all eternity, as Matthew will go on and explain. And there's a verse in here. It's sort of in Mark 13:10, you'll see, and the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. And Matthew says, and this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So Matthew considerably expands what Mark is saying in verse 10. So what is Matthew saying there? I mean, it's often been thought that Matthew is making a pitch to have a lot of disciples go throughout the world. That is not my opinion, but we're going to talk about that. So John's going to pop some questions up now.
Yep.
So what we want you to do in your groups this time is have a look at what is similar in each version. What are the differences? What Matthew has added? And you might want to think about why Matthew has done that. What is he saying? And it will help you if you recall what we did in the prophets. So how has Matthew changed Mark? What has he added or taken away? And why do you think he's done it? All right, how did you go with looking at Matthew and Mark and Matthew's changes and what they might mean?
We couldn't find a great deal that Mark had actually added, but particular terms, the word Messiah, the expression false prophets, but we thought that Mark was more comprehensive. It had a lot more in it than Matthew did, and it gives more detail. So are we right in assuming that?
I don't know. It does give you a lot more detail. I think Matthew changes the order of something, so you might have missed it. But I think basically, apart from the end of Mark where he says what you want to say will be given to you, which is in Matthew, but just not in this part here. So probably not on the whole. I don't think there's more detail in Mark.
We thought the tone was a bit different between them, and I didn't know whether that was the language used, but sort of Matthew, it's more distant. It's almost like writing an essay. This is what's going to happen. Whereas Mark, it felt very personal.
Right. Yeah, that's a good observation.
I noticed we were talking about the fact that you'd presumably intentionally given us the Greek so that the to all nations in Mark, that Greek is slightly different to throughout the world in Matthew.
Yes.
And then Matthew goes on as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come.
Yes.
And that bit is not in the Mark.
No, it's not. And that's an important piece of detail.
All right,
Well,
get ready to hear one chapter of Elizabeth's thesis now. Press button, go.
I thought it was important enough to write an entire journal article on it. So, but before I launch into that, someone else might have something they want to say from their groups.
Just to go back to what Sue said, I mean, one explanation for that could be that there's a theory that Mark was writing right in the middle of the war between the Jews and the Romans, which started in 66, although it had been building for some time. It started in 66. The temple was destroyed in 70, and the war, the Romans eventually won in 74. So Mark probably writing in 67, 68, 69 is the hypothesis. And whilst there's a tradition that Mark was writing in Rome, because that's where Peter was, there's a different view by a lot of scholars that Mark was actually in Galilee, writing in the midst of all of that. So he's in the middle of Ukraine as the Russian bombs are falling around him.
Yeah.
Whereas Matthew may well be, Elizabeth will say he's writing just a little bit later than Mark, but still within the war, but not immediately in that context. And, so he's sitting in England watching the war happening and saying how terrible it is, but not actually listening to the bombs falling, if you like, to give it a contemporary take.
Yeah. Yes.
Can I add, you've got that idea of lawlessness, and then, you know, further on, there's the man of lawlessness, you know, that Daniel sort of reference, that's in the
Yeah.
Matthew. And in the Mark, the very last bit that you highlighted, but the one who endures to the end will be saved, that is not, I couldn't see it in the Matthew excerpt. Am I wrong?
Well,
I
tell
don't
us is there in both. Tell us
Yeah.
the end. The one who endures to the end will be saved. But Matthew has changed that into like a timetable when the good news is proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony, then the end will come.
Yeah,
Yeah. So he gets rid of the enduring to the end.
that's right.
Hmm.
Any thoughts on why Matthew's altered that verse in 14 or to Mark 10 to add all those things in verse 14 in his version?
Well, you were saying at the beginning, I think it was John, was saying that this idea of, you know, you were saying earlier in Matthew's gospel, he's only talking about, you know, preaching to the Jews, that he's not interested in the rest. So is this all nations? Is this for the expansive, you know, gospel?
Yep, I'm glad you asked that question. Who remembers what happens with the nations in the prophets, especially Isaiah? And we've talked about the importance of Isaiah and Isaiah's influence on the New Testament writers. What did Isaiah say about the nations?
They
Who
all come.
remembers?
They all come.
They all come. And what happens? They
They all
play.
come and worship,
blackjack?
don't they?
They all what? Sorry, Elizabeth?
Don't they all come and worship? They all make their way to Jerusalem, you know,
Yeah.
sort of, and come and worship the one
so-
God.
And that's the Old Testament reading for Sunday from Isaiah
Yes.
2. Yes.
Yeah, that they're going to do that
Yeah.
because it's related to this. What if this is like the Old Testament in that it's what we'd call like a theophany or an epiphany? So there's this great understanding or proclamation that permeates across the nations of the world that calls them to Jerusalem to worship God. What if that is what Matthew's saying? Not that there's going to be a whole bunch of disciples go out and convert people. What if Matthew is talking about a day of the Lord sort of proclamation to all the nations simultaneously?
Changes things a bit, doesn't it?
It does change it. It does. And that's what my entire chapter was on, as John will tell you. And it was really controversial. I was accepted for publication with one group of people, but then their board of editors of 4, one of them said he wouldn't accept it, and they had a policy that they all had to agree. So it ended up not being published because it was completely controversial what I'm saying, because it does change it all. People want to relate this to the Great Commission, which my thesis is about, and say that this is about going and doing a whole kind of proselytizing of the world. I am saying this is Old Testament, and this is a great proclamation that is made about God to the nations, Old Testament Isaiah style. And as a result of that, they hear that, and then we have the end, that is the end of the world will happen. And Matthew goes on to talk about that in the next chapter. So that's my contention. And Matthew uses different words here, like throughout the world. He uses a word, oikumene, which is not used anywhere else. It's quite a rare word in the New Testament. And it kind of means the whole world's household. It's an unusual word that is used. Normally he uses different words when he's talking about the world in his gospel, and this is the only occurrence of it here. And I think he wanted to differentiate it. Because this is something special. This is something that it's one of those great proclamations of the day of the Lord that you get in the Old Testament. And this is what Matthew's doing. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it.
So when they say to all nations, and your Greek is panta te ethne, would that be
Yes.
relating to people?
It's usually translated Gentiles. It means non-Jews.
Okay. So what's ethne?
Ethne is nations or
Nation.
Gentile.
Okay.
And panta is all, and isis is two. It's a Greek preposition. They're slippery little devils. They can mean a number of different things. So, we have here that there will be proclaimed throughout the world. So all at once, there's this big proclamation that goes throughout the world and all its nations, and then the end comes. And we know from Matthew 25, that's precisely what happens. Jesus arrives on his cloud. All the nations are already assembled there, and he proceeds to judge them into sheep and goats. So in the context of Matthew, the idea this is a great proclamation that is made and all the nations hear it makes perfect sense. The idea that there's this whole long drip-fed kind of discipling going on doesn't in the context of this apocalyptic literature. Move on.
Happy to move on.
Yes. And you can read all my technical arguments for it on page 4 of your handout if you are so inclined.
Getting very technical.
Well, it's out of a thesis. That's why it's technical. John just plunked it there, so I take no responsibility for it other than writing it. So this is the next piece of Matthew that we want you to have a look at. And you'll notice there's a couple of bits highlighted in your handout on page 5. And you'll see that Matthew talks about desolating sacrilege, but makes a particular Old Testament reference to that Mark does not. And there's some other differences in it that you might like to look at. So we're going to ask you to do the same set of questions. What's similar? What differences? How has Matthew altered Mark's material? And why do you think he's done it? Well, how did you go with this section of Matthew?
Scary.
Scary.
Well, as an end, like as the end time comes and there's awful things happening, and you've got to run for your life and not look back, and hopefully it doesn't happen on a Sabbath.
He is a law-abiding Jew, so on the Sabbath, presumably you can't do the running away because you're limited to how far that you can travel, which is why he's popped that particular point in. So if it's on the Sabbath, you know, you can break the law and run for your life, or you can stay and be obliterated and stay law-abiding. So it's not much of a choice, really.
But the good news,
He talks about the time of year.
Elizabeth, can I ask? There's emphasis at several points in both readings on the elect, you know,
yes,
which raises the question: is this a teaching about predestination? If it isn't, how do you become a member of the elect? Do you know you're of the elect, or are you not going to find that out until the last day and when we all get judged?
It's a really good question, Ian, because today is the day to remember John Calvin, who majored in developing the doctrine of double predestination.
that's right. So it's only Calvinists who are going to get saved.
I don't think Matthew is a Calvinist.
No.
I don't think he's...
I've got problems with John Calvin, having come from a Methodist background where our hero is John Wesley.
Yes.
But I'm a Presbyterian.
Yes.
But John Calvin burnt opponents at the stake.
He did.
Yeah.
John Wesley never did.
Now, I'm not a fan of Calvin for a number of reasons, and that's one of them. I don't think Matthew is talking about predestination, because all through Matthew's gospel, we have him talking about how you can turn towards the right side. You have Jesus preaching, and it's always about you have a choice. You can choose this path or this path. So I don't think there's any sense of predestination in the Gospel of Matthew. I believe that there's actually two kind of final days in Matthew. There's this one, and there's one in chapter 25, which we will get to at some point. That's the sheep and the goats. Now, the sheep and the goats, it says all the nations gather. Here it's the elect. So it's not the same, I don't think. These are the people who've signed up to be followers of Jesus. These are his disciples and all the followers and all the Christian communities that have signed up in some way to follow Jesus. And they're the elect. And a little bit more is expected of them in terms of how they behave and how they conduct themselves and what they teach and where they are and what they're doing. So I think that's what Matthew is talking about. The Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven will send his angels and those elect will be gathered up. And of course, the rapture comes, a lot of rapture stuff will come from these chapters in Matthew. Like there's two in the field, one will be taken and one will be left, and there's two women and one will be taken and one will be left. It's probably a distortion of what Matthew is actually saying. But here he's talking about those who profess faith in him. In chapter 25, those people being judged, the nations, some of them have never heard of him and nothing is said about faith. It's how they behave. It's what they've done that they're judged on. So it's a different thing to what is being explained here in chapter 24, but it's not predestination. Well, they've all gone quiet now.
I think that killed it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kill it.
It was always doomed to happen, you know.
Very funny.
Oh, no.
You're hilarious. Any other comments on that people wanted to make? Bill, you wanted to make something earlier and you got a bit interrupted.
I'm over 75, so that thought is already gone.
Oh dear.
There's certainly the references more direct here in the Matthew to Daniel and the Messiah, that idea. They seem, you know, they're specific here. And that's reflected in, you know, the segment verses 26 to 28 in Matthew. There's nothing like that in the Mark. And some of us, well, in our little group, thought we'd never actually seen verse 28 before.
Yes. It's also in the Gospel of Luke, though I think it's in chapter 17. Is that right, John?
Yes, that's right.
So it occurs earlier in the Gospel of Luke. And Matthew is explaining about, you know, people who come and say they're the Messiah saying, I am he. And others will say, look, he's there, he's over here, or he's somewhere else. And Matthew's saying, don't believe it, because it's just, it's a distraction, and it's worse than that. It's the sort of thing that vultures gather around.
And Elizabeth, I wondered whether this segment, these verses here, were in fact bolstering your argument that this isn't about proselytizing and taking the gospel to all the nations, but rather there's going to be this great world event where everybody in the world will at the one and the same time see the coming of the second coming, the coming of the Son of Man.
Well, I think that's right. I would say that this makes that more explicit. And by the end of chapter 25, when it says all the nations are gathered and the Son of Man comes and he judges them, it's incredibly explicit that they're all there at once, that it isn't a slow process of going out and converting disciples, which you might say, well, what's the Great Commission all about? Well, you know, I contend Matthew never wrote it. So my whole thesis was entirely controversial, not just mine, looking at chapter 24 and verse 14. He does cite the prophet Daniel, Mark does not, and there is a desolating sacrilege set up. And this verse is what makes me think Matthew is writing earlier than Luke, because Luke gives you a graphic description of a destroyed Jerusalem in a couple of places in his gospel, about soldiers surrounding it and about it being pulled down. Matthew doesn't. He cites the prophet Daniel. So I don't know from this whether you can assume Matthew saw the destruction of Jerusalem or whether he was writing during the war that led up to that destruction, because he's not explicit the way Luke is. And it's for that reason I think Matthew's writing a little bit earlier than Luke. Any other comments on this? Are we all depressed yet?
Totally.
Oh,
How do you feel about this apocalyptic stuff? Is it real? Is it something we should be expecting, or is it just Matthew and Mark and Luke on their kind of Old Testament prophet high horses threatening everyone.
But I suggest that it's symbolic.
Yeah.
Symbolic, yeah. Do you want to unpack that, Rosemary?
I think it's because stating something for people to believe in, for them to grasp what's there, they paint a narrative. And the narrative is always one of hope. And I think this is hope, this Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven. I mean, every sensible person knows that you can't ride on a cloud, you'd fall. So it's symbolic in producing hope and giving them something to grasp onto.
Anyone want to comment on Rosemary's hypothesis of hope?
Well, I suppose it's like everything's contextual, isn't it? So
Yeah.
The context of this world in which they're writing is, you know, a pretty terrible time, and things are happening, and they're probably looking forward to something that's going to rescue them from the huge, you know, the crisis that they're enduring. Whereas in our context, it's totally different. We live in a very, for the most part, fairly peaceful times. And so I think we're happy to ignore the apocalyptic nature of all this and concentrate on, you know,
The
living
nicer things.
well,
Yeah.
living a good life as we interpret it, like trying to be faithful followers of Christ. Without
Can I just say that in the most apocalyptic chapter of them all, which is chapter 25, there's also a very heavy emphasis on righteousness. And there's, you know, going from verse 35 in chapter 25, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was sick and you took care of me, and so on and so on. So there's that emphasis on right behavior and showing your that you're one of the elect by behaving in the right way for the right reasons.
And it's
I'm
the
not sure they
nurturing.
are one of the part of the elect. Sorry, Patricia, what was that?
I was just going to say it's a nurturing thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is a nurturing thing. But nothing says these people are the elect. They're described as dikaiosune, which is just and righteous. They're not, there's faith is not even mentioned here. These are the nations that are gathered, and they're judged solely on how they behave to other people, not on their faith or discipleship. That's why I'm contending there's two judgments in Matthew. There's the elect, who are the believers, and then there's this other rabble who've
It's
never
all the
heard of
others.
Jesus.
When we talk about, when it talks about the nations being gathered together, is that nations as collectivities, or does it apply to us individually as citizens of nations?
No, it's nations collectively. I mean, they're made up of individual people, but it's a collective. It's plural. And they're judged differently. As you can see, they're not it doesn't say they're elect. It doesn't say their faith in Jesus or their discipleship is important. It's what they've done. These are people who may never have heard of Jesus. These are people solely judged on what they do. And that is a real spanner in the works for your average evangelical, Matthew 25. And you've got to tie your exegetical knickers into big knots to try and make that chapter fit with evangelicalism, because it doesn't.
No.
It's saying you are saved by your works. However, if you're a follower of Jesus, you'll be judged probably differently. And that's what Matthew 24 is referring to. Right, we've got one more task for you. As you can see, there's another block there, but I want you to concentrate on one thing in this. You can have a look. Matthew is quite different because he's going to add a whole chapter that Mark doesn't have. But the thing I want you to look at is verse 34. Mark's got it and Matthew's got it. What does it mean? What is Jesus saying? What are we to draw from that? So have a look at that particularly and see what you make of that. So can you pull it down, please, John? And I'll pop them back into breakout rooms. Back for our final question and reflection time. So, anyone have something they would like to offer?
Apart from more argument about what a generation means.
Well, what do you think it means, Piers?
Well, I think a generation's about 40 years, but clearly the end of the world didn't come after 40 years. So,
No.
and in the case of Noah, it was 40 days, wasn't it? I mean, they were floating around in their ark for 40 days, but the people who the flood arrived was pretty instantaneous, as has been occurring in bits of New South Wales at the moment.
Yep.
And haven't we been having just recently a lot of lectionary readings about no one knows, there's been a lot of references to the end times and no one knows. So this is sort of, if you like, a bit of a follow on.
It is, but does it actually suggest that no one knows the time? Isn't there a time frame suggested by this verse?
Yeah, and that's peculiar to me that there is a time frame being suggested.
Yes.
Because all the others have no time frames.
Correct. They don't.
And Jesus says elsewhere, no one knows.
So what's it doing here?
And he says in that same thing in verse 36 in Matthew, no one knows.
Is this a case of Jesus getting it wrong?
Yes.
Jesus said it's going to happen within the lifetimes of you people listening to me, but of course it doesn't. And it's
No.
So was Jesus lacking in divine prescience? Was he not omniscient? He plainly got it wrong.
Well, he did. I think you're right, Ian. Jesus did get it wrong. And you might think, well, how do you know that? I would put to you that the fact we've got all this stuff about saying that Jesus coming back has been delayed suggests that they were expecting him much earlier and they had to find reasons and explanations why it wasn't there. And the fact that this verse is preserved suggests to me Jesus must have actually said it. Otherwise, when you know full well, especially if you're Luke, when you know full well it hasn't happened, why would you include it unless Jesus actually said it? So that's my theory. And again, I'm sticking to it. I think this is a genuine saying of Jesus, and I think he got it wrong.
But then the gospel writers, Matthew and Mark, then in the very next verse, they hedge their bets by saying, look, no one knows the day nor the hour. So they cover themselves, and they covered Jesus by saying, look, it's a bit indeterminate.
Yeah, it would make more sense if they dropped that verse, but the fact they've kept it, as I said, suggests strongly to me it was a well-known saying Jesus said. Otherwise, you wouldn't preserve it.
And there's an interesting little note about verse 36, because in that verse it says, nobody knows when that day will be, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So that sort of looks like maybe Jesus could be wrong. But the interesting thing is, as you know, we don't have the original version of the Gospels. We have a whole lot of copies made by scribes over centuries. And one of the textual variants that's quite interesting is in this verse, and that is the phrase, nor the Son, is missed out. So if you leave that out, that says only God knows when the end will be. Not even Jesus knows.
Any other comments that people want to make? Of course, these Matthew 24 then moves into the next chapter, which is a whole lot of stuff about virgins who are waiting for the bridegroom, and those who are alert and those who prepare, and culminating in the story of the sheep and the goats, where Mark moves immediately to the arrest of Jesus. So Matthew has included all this extra material in his apocalypse about thieves breaking into households and bridesmaids with lamps. And there's the parable of the talents about how you use things according to your ability. And then, of course, this last great scene of judgment of the nations, when the sheep and the goats are divided, and the righteous sheep go into heaven and the unrighteous or unjust goats end up in a fire of flame along with the devil, which sounds very nasty to me. So Matthew has this whole chunk of material that Mark does not, some of it very unique to Matthew. Are there any final comments on Matthew and his apocalypse? I mean, it's fairly grim reading, but I would be, as Rosemary said, I'd be reading it contextually and not taking it as a literal blueprint for what is going to happen at the end of the world. And next week, we're going to get a bit cheerier. We're going to be looking at genealogies.
Elizabeth, in one earlier Bible study pre-COVID, you said that Matthew was your favourite gospel or your favourite book. Could you explain why? Do you like the apocalyptic stuff?
No, I don't like Matthew's theology. I think it's pretty scary, and seeing Jesus is fairly frightening. I'd prefer the Lucan one if I'm going to run into one. I like Matthew because I find him so interesting. He's got stuff in his gospel that isn't in the other gospels. And he's got really interesting little bits and pieces that are embedded through his gospel that I just personally find interesting. There was two things that drew me to Matthew. One was I discovered Matthew was graceless. Matthew does not use the word grace anywhere in his gospel, and that is highly unusual. And that got me interested in him, why, and pursuing that. And the other thing was looking at Matthew's use of tzedakah and righteous justice, and how he used that. And it was so different, particularly with the sheep and the goats. And then the thing that clinched the deal for me is looking at the bulk of the gospel and the Great Commission. I thought, how on earth does this anti-Gentile, pro-Jew, pro-law gospel writer end up with that Great Commission? And that led me down a really interesting pathway through the patristics and looking at things like Eusebius. So I got hooked on Matthew because I just found him a really elegant writer who develops these really interesting themes that you just don't find in the other Gospels, like his Moses thread, for instance. He has this whole Moses typology going on that's unique to Matthew. So that's why. It's not because I admire his theology. It's not because I like putting people I dislike in hell, which Matthew delights in. He does it quite a lot. I don't like those things much at all. It's just interesting.
Thank you.
Any other comments before we end?
Can we just ignore these chapters?
Well, you can. But the fact it's on the lectionary and it's Advent, and this is the reading for Sunday, we felt that looking at it was not a bad thing to do. And you can feel free to ignore them if you wish. Next week, I think it'll be a lot more fun. We're going to be looking at Matthew's genealogy, and Luke's, which of course is central to proving Jesus was a descendant of the Davidic line and the Messiah. And the interesting thing about them, apart from the fact they're different ways around, one starts at the end and one starts at the beginning. You'll see what I mean when you look at them. They're not the same. And Matthew's is highly formulaic, and Matthew has a whole bunch of wicked women in his, which I quite like.
Yes.
So we'll be looking at those as well, Matthew and his wicked women.
And his non-Jewish women.
Well, some of them are Jewish. It's wrong to say that they're not Jewish. I mean, in Genesis, no one's Jewish. Tamar marries the son of Judah, so she's as Jewish as you're going to get in that particular time. No one's Jewish in Genesis, including Abraham.
But Rahab and
Ruth certainly are not. Bathsheba probably was. even though she's married to a Hittite, she probably was. The fact that she was queen and her son was recognised as a legitimate king says she's Jewish at that time. So there's no evidence to say otherwise. So that the theory that they're all Gentile, put that down the toilet, because only I think 2 of them are, and I think Matthew includes them for other reasons, and you'll just have to think about that, about what you think that other reason why he's got. And I'm giving you a clue: wicked women, unruly women.
Isn't that a tautology?
No, smarty pants. It's all right. I'll just pour some coffee over him, Ian. Okay, if there's no final comments or questions, I look forward to seeing you all next week and exploring genealogies with you and wicked women.
Okay.